Hey, so the final video I wanted to share with you guys was really going to be addressing the issue of history. So it's going to be a little bit philosophical in a way. Um, it's going to be rethinking the where we put ourselves within this historical context. So some have argued that we can divide up all of human history into three phases. There'd be the pre-modern, and pre-modern would be anything before about 1500 AD. So Jesus was pre-modern. The Israelites, even the Greeks, were all pre-modern. And the idea was that in pre-modern times, when we thought about truth, we were basically at that time the idea of truth was simply that truth was whatever people agreed it to be. If you felt it was true, if you could argue that it was true, then it was true. So there's a sense of like authority that conveyed truth. So in pre-modern times, there was a lot of hierarchy. There's the people, the peasants, and they sort of just subscribe to the authority figures, the kings, the princes, the religious authorities, and said, okay, that's where truth is found, is whatever they say is true. Um, and in pre-modern times, there's a sense that with authority figures being the root um, of all truth, the only way to really prove your authority is through violence, is to like show that you're more powerful than others. So if I wanted to prove that my view was right, then I need to conquer you, and then therefore my view is correct. And so violence was built into the system, that it was assumed that there'd be warfare to sort of tease apart the power structures and to um, basically prove truth. And so that's sort of the pre-modern time. So there's a lot of superstition, a lot of animism about like the world, and the idea that everything is meaningful, everything is purposeful. So the rain is an act of God, and and so on. And about the time of 1500, it's a rough date, and it's the time of Columbus, the time of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, all of those things kind of coming together at the same time, really shifted the way people viewed the world. And I'd kind of point out the printing press as a good example of this. So um, one of the things you may not know is that once the printing press was um, invented, it became hugely popular, right? You can now share information on mass scale. So there was this issue where people were presenting their ideas, and actually a lot of people were writing books and distributing those books, and people were disagreeing with books. And when you have authors presenting different ideas, it became apparent that we can't just fight each other and prove our ideas to be correct or not. We needed a higher system. And so within that time, from the 1500s to about mid 19th century or mid 20th century, mid 1900s, um, we had the development of the scientific method. And the scientific method was really the development of this idea, sort of a scientific perspective that says we need to have evidence to prove a point. You can't just say something and assume that people will believe you based upon your authority or your perceived authority or anything like that. You actually have to, make the case. And so from that perspective, the idea of an objective method to to prove that you're right made a lot of sense. And so again, with that system, we set into motion this idea like, okay, we need to collect observations. We need to use a systematic method. We need to evaluate the findings. And then we need to make interpretations and build theory around our observations, not just do armchair theorizing. And modernity was really obsessed with the objective, trying to figure out what is the objective truth, and believing in scientific. They talked about positivism, so the idea that the scientific progress is going to lead to better improvements in society and the world around us, and it's just going to keep moving us forward. And then finally, in the mid 20th century, we had, well, I'd say the biggest factor was World War II and the invention of the nuclear bomb. And what that did was it really shattered this idea that science is just going to make the world better. So all of humanity was, or all of at least Western civilization was looking at science as a salvific force. Here's something that's going to save us, to better our civilization. And actually, what science gave us was a tool for mass destruction. So that the inventors of the atomic bomb, even they regretted what they had contributed to. They had a sense of remorse that they had developed this weapon. And really that changed things for society when we realized maybe science isn't going to make us better. And sort of within that, there was also this idea of within philosophy that maybe we shouldn't be so obsessed with objectivity. Maybe we need to appreciate that each person has their own unique story and their own unique perspective, and that perspective is not something that we're trying to set aside and put away. That perspective is actually who we are. That when we engage with truth, we're engaging from our real experiences and our real lives. And so we don't want an objective truth, we want a subjective truth. Not to say that we don't want to have some boundaries within that, and we're not just all completely relativistic, but also recognizing that we are not going to ever rise above our own subjectivities. We're always going to be biased. We're always going to have a lens in regards to the world around us that perceives it a certain way. And so I'd say we're living in a postmodern world. Now, I've asked other students in other classes this question, and never really gotten much of a strong response. But I know there's a view out there within Christianity that argues that postmodernity is probably the worst philosophy imaginable. That the idea that there's no truth, and that everything is relative, everything, we can make anything to be a truth, and we just have to agree to it. There's some Christians who perceive postmodernity that way, and claim that it's a huge threat. And so I don't know if any of you kind of come from that background, but I want to reassure you that I don't think postmodernity teaches those things. I think Christians actually get a lot of the claims of postmodernity wrong. Now, that's not to say that there aren't anyone out there, that there isn't anyone out there who makes some of those claims, because certainly there are some people out there who claim, oh, that's your truth. That's kind of a bizarre term that I've heard, but I think it's kind of off basis. The truth doesn't belong to any of us, right? That the truth is simply out there, X-Files, but no, it's the truth exists, and we're just simply trying to encounter it, understand it, appreciate it, and become aware of it. And so I do think there is some threat there in regards to postmodernity, but actually I think there's a lot to postmodernity that I think is an asset for Christians. It's an asset for Christian integration, actually. And the the components of it are, first off, the appreciation that God has put us into our lives and has equipped us with certain life experiences that are our own, and that God has given us these life experiences so that we can participate in bringing God's kingdom fully alive. So, what do I mean by that? Um, Heidegger writes about the thrownness of humanity, that we're just simply thrown into our life circumstances. So we're put into these circumstances of, the gender we are, the ethnicity we are, our parents, the location we're born. We didn't choose any of these things. We are simply given them or bestowed them. And there needs to be some appreciation that that is outside of our control, and yet God willed it, right? God chose this diversity, this representation. And so I think that actually um, postmodernity appreciates that God's intention was diversity, and so we should therefore appreciate that different people have different perspectives. If we all needed to see things the same, God would have created us all the same. He would have made us to have very little and minor differences between one another. We'd all have the same gifts. We'd all have the same personality. But no, actually, God created us with diversity so that we can all together collectively better understand God's will and God's purpose, and enact God's kingdom into the world. So that's one of the things I think postmodernity values. The other thing is the appreciation that we cannot obtain truth through a scientific or any kind of method, right? So modernity argued, well, if you just simply use the right method, which might be the scientific method, then you're going to obtain some objective truth. And you're going to come to know that truth without any bias, any subjectivity. And they claim that that was the best way to know. And the problem was that the the question of how did you design your study? How did you uh, decide upon that topic as the most important thing to study? The way that you think about the problem, the way that you interpret your findings, all of that, there is subjectivity all along. And really, the modernists were arguing that we're objective when in fact, no, we were subjective all along. We had biases all along. So postmodernity embraces this idea that our lives, our history, our personality, all of those things are things that shape us and will cause us to be subjective. And again, instead of rising above it, no, we embrace it and say, this is my view of the truth. So the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that we see through a mirror darkly, or see through a glass darkly, depending on your translation. And there's this idea that I think is scriptural, that in our life today, on this earth, we will not know the truth clearly. We are not going to see things without distortion while we're on earth. Maybe in heaven we will, but certainly not in this life. And we should, instead of trying to assume that, if I can just get away from that, then I'm going to encounter the real truth. No, that was the sin of Adam and Eve. They wanted to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to know truth that excluded God. No, I would say that we need to appreciate that we're not going to know the full truth, and actually embrace that and say, okay, we're going to do our best and pursue knowledge, but pursue it in a way that acknowledges our createdness, that we're not these objective God-like figures, right? And I think that's where modernity got it wrong. And so, and finally, I think postmodernity is a gift because it recognizes that there's been some injustices to certain groups of people. We've listened to certain voices more than others, and so I say this as a white male, who is cisgender and heterosexual. I recognize that I've had privileges that my voice gets heard more than others, and so I appreciate that, and I wish to lend my privilege and use it for good, right? Which is to say that I want to equip others who don't have that privilege to have a voice. I want all people to be heard. So postmodernity says we should, in terms of justice, consider our diversity and lift up others who don't have their voice and allow them to speak into the truth finding process. And so I'd say that's the third major thing that postmodernity gives us is it equips us to think about the search for justice as a process that has social justice components. So again, I think postmodernity as a framework, it's not to say it's without issue. I think that there can be some concerns that are valid and that we need to watch out for, like relativism. But I also think that there's so much good usefulness in terms of a Christian approach to integration, the humility of it, the recognition of our diversity, and the recognition of listening to the voices of those who aren't being heard is so critical. And Christians need to, I'd say, not fully embrace it, but to cautiously embrace it and say, what can this way of thinking open up for us, and how can we know the world and know God better through postmodernity? So, all right, that was it for this one, and I think that's going to be it for this week. And I'll hope you guys enjoyed it, and would love to hear your feedback, any questions you might have, and anything else you want to share. You could share that on the discussion, or you could share it next week in our class. All right, and have a good night or good day. All right.